Trends in global peace in 2014. One might be forgiven for wondering what trends, given what's just developing in Iraq at the moment, what's been happening since February at least in Ukraine, as well as the ongoing situation in Syria, the total paralysis of the Israel-Palestinian peace process, apparently escalating conflict in the South China Sea. But the Global Peace Index will tell us where we are now in its 8th year of publication, developing a considerable back catalogue from which we can gauge the trends in global peace and peacemaking. I'm delighted to welcome Steve Killelea, who is the founder and chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace, and of course the founder of the Global Peace Index. And Steve will be giving the first presentation this evening, to be followed by our other two distinguished guests, Pilar Domingo, a research fellow at the Overseas and Development Institute, currently researching international support for the rule of law, justice and security sector, following a long and distinguished career at the University of London, University of Salamanca, and Queen Mary University, also here in London. And on the far side, Chris Austin, who, after a long career in government, is now heading the Stabilisation Unit, which sits in the Foreign Office but is made up of DFID, the FCO, and the MOD, which is a unique cross-government body. He might tell us how well that's going. Formerly the head of G8 based in the Cabinet Office, and formerly head of conflict, humanitarian and security at DFID. So the way this will take place is that Steve will start us off, to be followed by Pilar and then Chris, and then hopefully we will leave plenty of time, and I will be timing everybody and trying to keep us on time because we have to stop on the dot at 7, and leaving plenty of time, hopefully, for comments and questions from the room. Steve.
Well, thank you very much. So good to be here. So what I'll be doing is covering two things today. The first is I'll be moving through the trends associated with peace over the last year, and also 7-year trends. And then I'll move into a methodology we developed for doing country risk analysis. And so all in all, I'll be talking for about 15 minutes. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, it's been set up to study the intersection between business, peace and economics, placing special emphasis on the measure of metrics to measure peace, and also to do analysis to understand the factors which are associated with peaceful societies. Additionally, we also do a lot of work around ascribing value to changes in peacefulness, and now we're starting to move into doing more work around country risk analysis. So we'll move straight into the highlights. So if we look the last 12 months, there's again been a slight deterioration in peace. This follows now a 7-year trend. So if we look at the reasons behind the deterioration in the last 12 months, it's related to, unsurprisingly, terrorist activity. It's an increase in the number of internal and external conflicts fought. It also increases in the number of deaths from internal conflicts. Syria, for example, is up to 120,000 now. And also the number of refugees and displaced people, with 1/3 of the people in Syria, for example, being displaced as well. However, contrary to that, there are some good trends. One is that there's been an improvement in the political terror scale, and that is a measure of human rights abuses around the world, and that also is a continuing trend. If we look at the number of armed service personnel, that has also decreased. And this year there's also been a slight drop in the number of homicides, but we would say that's probably down to improved numbers rather than it's a trend. In fact, the longer term trend's going the other way. So Syria now has become the bottom of the Global Peace Index. It replaces Afghanistan, which had been there the 2 years prior to that. And prior to that, it had been Iraq. But Iraq may be back there next year. Iceland maintains its position as the most peaceful nation in the world, and has done for many, many years. Iceland was one of the countries most affected by the global financial crisis. And you can see the resilience of highly peaceful societies that it's been able to maintain intact and recover. Georgia contrary to what a lot of people may think, has shown the biggest improvement in the last 12 months. That's obviously coming out of the back of a conflict with Russia over South Ossetia and sort of the bounce which comes with that. But I would say that that recovery is fragile. Southern Sudan had the largest drop this year as it moves into its third civil war since independence, and now has ranked the third least peaceful nation in the world. Now, one of the more surprising things is actually Europe. Its peace is actually improving. Some good news. 25 of the countries improved, where 9 deteriorated. Most of this improvement's actually out of Eastern Europe, which you can see is related to fairly robust economic conditions compared to the rest of Europe. And if we look at now Europe over the 7 years, actually the peace hasn't changed at all. Europe maintains its rank as the most peaceful region of the world as well. South Asia is again the least peaceful nation in the world. Deteriorations, or the largest deteriorations, were in the Middle East and North Africa as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa highlighted by Southern Sudan and Central African Republic. So if we look at the 7-year trends, we divide the index up into 3 different areas, and I'll hit each of those 3 major domains. Safety and security, it declined by 5.3% over the last 7 years, and this is, of course, the major deterioration in the index overall because of the strong weighing and the number of indicators in that portion. Militarisation didn't actually change over that period of time. A couple of indicators were up, others were down, but it was flat. If we look at the measures of ongoing conflict, they declined, so they're 4.7%. So as we can see, this isn't falling off a cliff, but it's a slow, gradual decline each year. Now, the 2 biggest things driving this are increased terrorist activity and higher homicide rates. So over this period of 7 years, 53 countries actually improved. But on the other hand, 111 countries actually deteriorated. Now, greatest deteriorations were in Middle East, North African, Sub-Saharan African regions. Now, what I've got here is just a graph from deaths from terrorism. So if we go to 2002, there's just basically over about 2,000 deaths from terrorism. The start of the Iraq War, that started to tick up. It's another leg as we got more active and engaged in Afghanistan, and then that filled over into Pakistan. Then with the withdrawal from Iraq, period of stability went through with some decrease in the number of terrorist activity. Then with the start of the Syrian war, it's now taken off again. So in 2002, there was 38 countries which had deaths from terrorism. In 2014, there are now 58 countries. So this is a trend which is continuing, and I'd say at this stage it'd have to be a very worrying trend. Now, if we start to look at the nations which have had the largest increases in terrorist activity, they're highlighted here in light blue. You can note that the number of deaths in Iraq, which is the top, number of deaths in Iraq, which is the top line, the way it's increased over the last 3 years. So in some way, the message was already there. So if we look at the number of deaths from terrorism in 2013, that's about the same as what there was at the height of the surge in 2006. If we look at the homicides, we can see that there's a gradual increase over there. Even though it's fallen off this year, we think that's probably more through improved record keeping. If we look at the migration to the cities, we would expect this to keep up. There are currently 3.5 billion people living in cities. It's estimated by 2050 there'll be 7 billion people living in cities, double the current amount. So now this will be a slow, gradual turn up, and it probably is a problem which is manageable over time. Contrasting with this in the West, we've got falling crime rates. Britain, for example, has fallen crime rates, as has the US and many European cities. We also do estimates on the cost of violence to the global economy. So in 2013, we estimate it was almost $10 trillion. That's the equivalent of just over 11% of global GDP. Now, what's unique about this series of work is we actually put in, we do estimates for 162 different countries around the world. What that means is you can now look at a country and you've got the ability to be cost-benefit analysis on what any interventions may be. We measure 13 different dimensions. That'd be something like military expenditure, cost of homicides, cost of violent crime, cost of refugees, so on and so forth. And with the increase with 3.8% from 2012 to 2013. Now, what I'm going to do now is move on. That was very, very quick, but that's okay. I'll move on now to the risk tool and just give a quick thumbnail sketch of what we're doing now to analyse country risk. So, conceptually, there are factors which create peaceful societies. We could call these, let's say, the pillars of peace. So they're things like a well-functioning government, strong business environments, low levels of corruption, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relationships with neighbours, high levels of human capital. This comes together in a systemic way. We're not actually looking at causality because in any particular situation, the causality could run in either direction and the strength of the causality will be different. So we're taking a systems approach to try and understand what creates peace. So in arriving at this, we've been through 3,800 different data sets to statistically determine these models. If we look at these pillars of peace, if you like, they're also associated with a lot of other things which we really like higher per capita income, lower inflation, countries which are more ecologically sound, better on gender equality, and many more. So now that's the philosophical base, or the conceptual base, which we're going to work from to understand peace. Now, there's also a strong relationship between peace and economic growth. So if we look at this graph here, so if we look at the 45 countries which are the least peaceful compared to the 45 countries which are the most peaceful, they're the blue on this graph, you get, since 1996, there's been a 2% GDP higher growth rate. 2% may not sound much, but that's a lot, particularly when compounded. Similarly, if we came back and look at the positive peace, or the factors which are associated with peaceful societies, and we take it back to 1996, we see exactly the same relationship. The countries which are strongest in the pillars of peace have got 2.5% higher GDP growth rate than countries which are low in it. Now, just to drive that home even further, let's look at inflation. So what we've got here is a chart on the variability of inflation. So we'll note that the most peaceful nations have 1/3 of the rate of variability of the least peaceful nations. So now, in terms of sort of business investment and being able to understand risk and being able to plan what your likely return might be on an investment, this is highly important. So they're just a couple of many, many factors which we've got which are associated between peace, particularly positive peace, and economic prosperity and growth. Now, let's come back to what we're trying to do. So, conceptually, improvements in positive peace lead to higher GDP growth and also to improved human satisfaction. Increases in violence lead to lower GDP growth and less human satisfaction. So, conceptually, we measure violence. From there, we do statistical analysis to understand the factors associated with positive peace. Having got that, we now produce another index to measure that. Now we can look at the relationship between the two. And where there's a differential between the two, that's risk. Because historically, what you find is the two come back and meet in the middle. So if a country's got higher positive peace factors than its peace, over time, usually that peace will improve. If it's got lower positive peace factors than what its actual peace is, in time it'll come back again. So this is a scatter diagram. So you can see that there's a line through the centre, that's the ideal mean, and you can see the countries in 2000 and 13 and the way they differ from that. So at one end you've got Laos, which would have a deficit, so we'd expect that to fall in peacefulness. On the other hand, there's potential in Israel for it to improve because its societal factors are actually pretty strong. Now, we took to 2008 and we took the countries which had the 30th largest positive peace deficits. By 2014, 27 of them have actually fallen. Now, we're not talking about them falling into cataclysmic conflict. We're talking about just falls in peace because we look at small to medium falls in peace for doing this analysis. So that's what we call a positive peace deficit model. We have another model, which we call a like country model, which is really quite complex. So we take the history of a country and see how it compares to where it is currently. We take another basket of countries with similar levels of or factors related to positive peace, see what level of peace they are at, and then we put that into a fairly sophisticated model to calculate the likelihood of drop. Now, when we take this and we look at the 10 countries, we take these two models, combine them, and we look at the 10 countries which had the largest fall between 2008 and 2014 in peace. 9 of the 10 would have been picked up by these two combination of the two models. Mexico wasn't. So now if we look at the World Bank Fragility Index, the Failed State Index and the State Fragility Index, which are the main ones used, it'll be about 2 to 3 minutes. The main ones used, they're not trying to do prediction. They're measuring fragility, but they aren't actually very useful for prediction. But they're the main things being used today. Now, let's come back and look at the countries which now, if we take these models and play it forward, which have the most likelihood or the highest risk factor of falls of small to medium deteriorations in peace. So what is a small to medium deterioration in peace? It'd be, let's say, an increase of 2 per 100,000 in the homicide rate. So these are the 10 countries which are there. Note Qatar. Now, Qatar ended up on the list well before what we saw, which is going on at the moment. Now, in summary, so you can measure and analyse peace. That allows you to understand the factors which create peace. Similarly, you can measure and analyse peace, which now gives you an idea of the lost opportunity in dollar value of not having peace. Now, that gives you something you can actually action. That action gives you the ability to be able to make better prediction, therefore you know better where to target your assets and your resources. It also means you can now actually start to try and maybe do a little bit of cost-benefit analysis through the actions you take, what the benefit might be. And also, because for better understanding of the factors which actually create, sustain and underpin peace, you've got a much better chance of getting better program outcomes. And that, my friends, is the end of my talk.
Steve, fascinating. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Masses of material there for us to ask and talk about later, I'm sure. But, Pilar.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here as we reflect on the findings of the Global Peace Index of 2014. And I think one of the things that's clearly demonstrated is the tremendous value of capturing change over time and capturing change over time across a wide range of indicators, including to be able to give us a mapping over time of the nature of these very complicated processes of change from conflict to peace, and then what accounts for peace becoming the norm rather than the exception, and how to capture the risk and the return to conflict. But it also enables us to be able to track over time the risks associated with the transformation of conflict. So looking at the change from a negative peace, which is valuable in itself, to what a positive, more resilient form of peace can look like. And I think that's where some of my commentaries will mostly be aimed at, to disaggregate a little bit more what that positive peace looks like and why that is more difficult to capture in the kind of indicator sets that you see, the kind of indicators that the Global Peace Index is able to work with. And I'm thinking there are four things that I'm going to mention briefly that I think are important and that in the qualitative research that we're doing in ODI, fundamental for understanding processes of stabilization over time and the possibility of moving towards more resilient developmental models of progress. The four things I want to talk about very briefly are political settlements, understanding the resilience of political settlements and the ability of political processes to transform political settlements towards more resilient modes of engagement between state and society and between different private actors and societal actors. A theme that's come up increasingly in recent research on these issues related to the resilience of institutions, that the perceptions that societies have about institutions as institutions that are trustworthy and that are responsive to society's needs. This is the second point I want to discuss very briefly. The third is related to that, how to capture legitimacy. Legitimacy in a range of ways that doesn't necessarily correlate with levels of democracy, but with precisely these questions of resilience of institutions. And finally, a word on gender and the instrumental value of using gender as a way of capturing some of these more qualitative distinctions of what might amount to a more comprehensive notion of positive peace. And the example I've been thinking about is Colombia. I was there recently, and there's to do a case study on gender inclusiveness and women's empowerment in the last 20 years in Colombia. But the political settlement and the process of renegotiating or not, the underlying terms of, basically the underlying rules of engagement on social, economic, and political engagement of what is at stake with the current peace process. And things look really positive. Santos has won again. We're all on a fantastic trajectory, including as picked up by the Global Peace Index, to move from, I don't know, maybe a negative piece of sorts that was acquired with Uribe of sorts, I stress, to something that could amount to much more systemic, positive peace that will result from peace negotiation with the armed movement. But in fact, I think my question would be, to what extent could the Peace Index be able to capture, for instance, what might be more, in fact, a transformation of violence, in the sense that the way in which the peace agreement has been settled, the peace settlement has been agreed through the peace process, built on the political transformation under Uribe, to what extent we're just seeing a transformation of violence rather than a pacification of the real political settlement in Colombia, in the sense that what seems not to be captured as much as that much of what's driving, for instance, a deteriorating indicator with relation to displacement is that the cause of displacement is not only the armed guerrilla groups, but in fact the paramilitary forces and their transformation currently into criminal bands. What's left of them seem to be transforming into criminal bands. So that would get picked up in a different indicator that's not political conflict, but the kind of safety and security indicators that the Peace Index does capture. But I think being able to get to the more qualitative aspects of understanding that transformation is an interesting thing to be able to want to reflect within the context of the index. The second question is in relation to, okay, so what can we know about the resilience of institutions, and to what extent does the index engage with how to capture the resilience of institutions? And I understand that it does so through survey material that captures perceptions and attitudes relating to the trustworthiness of institutions. But there, I suppose, the key factor has to do with the degree to which peace and positive peace correlates with the legitimacy of the ruling political settlement, and the degree to which reigning institutions are resilient because they are able to adapt and transform the political settlement in ways that maximise the legitimacy of institutions to be responsive not only to elite bargains, but to those sectors of society that, to the degree that important sectors of society remain excluded and perceived themselves to be excluded from the political settlement. That is what leads to this heightened risk, as we're seeing currently, for instance, in the case of Iraq. So the texture and quality of political settlements seen through different lenses seems to be fundamental, including in order to be able to capture different perspectives of legitimacy. We can talk about that later. But finally, a word on gender. I'd be curious to see what place gender plays in the index, including because it seems that gender is a very observable measure of inclusivity, and it could respond to some of these questions of legitimacy, inclusivity, and responsiveness that are difficult to capture in that positive peace component. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chris.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to comment. A caveat, first of all, about me. I've been in the stabilisation unit since January. I know quite a bit about what our bit of government does. I cannot pretend to be an expert on any of the countries that you might be thinking about asking me or the rest of the panel difficult questions on, so I'll just get that caveat out. The second thing to note is that when I was at university, I studied history, and I very much value learning from experience, and I think that's one of the fundamental values of this very comprehensive index, drawing on such a mass of data, but putting it into a digestible form. It's really valuable. I have to say it's the first time that I and my colleagues have come across it, but you've certainly landed with a very receptive audience. I've got four observations about the report, and then some questions or challenges, possibly for you, Steve, and the Institute, possibly for discussion. I mean, first of all, this is a really helpful empirical contribution to planning and tracking international community efforts to build stability. And that's very much a cornerstone of UK government policy. It was set out in the National Security Strategy in 2010, underpinned by our Strategic Defence and Security Review and a Building Stability Overseas strategy, all of which set out in different ways that it's in the UK's interests to intervene or be involved in international crises and conflicts because it's in our national interest. It affects us. How we do that, we are learning as we go along, and that's part of what the Stabilisation Unit does. Equally importantly, from me with a DFID background, is that the Global Peace Index, I think, reinforces the rationale that our government, our Prime Minister has for having an aid budget at 0.7% of GNI. And he said, and has invited officials to be boring about this, so I shall be boring. It's right that the UK keeps its promises to the world's poor. It's the right thing for a richer country to have a significant aid program. It's a tiny fraction of your tax revenues, as I'm sure you'll know. And then thirdly, most importantly, it's in our own interests. And I think what this report does is help illustrate and demonstrate hard financial economic facts, how it is in our interests. The cost of conflict at over 11% of global GNI is quite staggering. And the counterfactual of that, the benefits of peace in any individual country, can be quite strong. I think I'll be really keen to draw on the data in the report to inform our own cost-benefit analyses of intervening, not intervening, and then thinking about what the specific measures might be. The second observation or question is, do we need to worry about the downward trends in peace? You know, as I read the report, there's 60 years where generally things have been getting better and more peaceful, but over the last 7 years, while you've been doing this index, maybe because you've been doing this index and your modelling is very clever, you're finding that things are getting worse. I would say that depends where you live. If you live in any of the countries that are on the IEP watch list, which includes Georgia that you mentioned, where the recovery has been fragile, then I think you should be very worried, because the report's also quite clear that your predictability is pretty good at where things might go bad. But of course, the conflict drivers, as well as the sources of positive peace, will be very much context specific, and that will be in time and place and maybe ethnic area and so on. So drilling into the detail is really important. I think the country risk analysis is very valuable. When it comes to the suggestions, I wonder whether you might expand that a little bit. So having said that, it gives us cause to worry, and it will certainly contribute to the thinking that we do in the UK government about which countries we should be worried about because they're at risk of falling into conflict, and is there anything that we can do about it or that we ought to track. Also bears noting that no modelling, however sophisticated, can be a perfect crystal ball. And it's slightly odd to see that Libya is in the top 5 of countries where there's been an improvement on a peace indicator, because that seems counterintuitive. I mean, you explained earlier, Steve, that the reasons for that is that there's a bounce out of the process that Libya went before. I guess the obvious conclusion to make is that what happens in countries affected by conflict will be followed by a non-linear, bumpy, unpredictable process. But what this index does is give us a very rich source of information to think what might be the drivers of change over time. Third observation, what have we learned? What have we learned in government, and how is it reinforced by the GPI report? This really strong correlation between effective democratic institutions and peace very much echoes our Prime Minister's golden thread theory, which I'm sure many of you are familiar. But if you have an absence of conflict and you have rule of law and a strong democratic political settlement, then you've got the enabling framework for economic growth and prosperity and security. It was interesting that high population features as a major correlation with potential conflict or actual conflict. I wondered whether that's also population density, and there seems to me, I think, to be a link to non-political drivers of conflict. Certainly the scramble for water, food and power, and potentially the risk of epidemics in densely populated areas. Fourth observation, what is the government doing to promote peace, build stability? I mentioned point 7, that's a key part of it. Within the development budget, the UK is focusing very much on fragile and conflict-affected states. We broadly agree with your definition of fragility, which I won't get into. A large part of that effort is to try and build resilience, economic, political, and social in those countries. The unit that I work in now is a very strong cross-government mechanism for operating the National Security Council's priorities to help contribute to responding to conflict or helping reduce the risk of conflicts emerging. In particular, we are the advocates of what in the UK we call the integrated approach to stabilisation, which comprises both civil and military components. I very much agree with Pilar that I think gender ought to be a dimension in the index. It's very much a feature of the UK's approach. We had the summit last week focusing on preventing sexual violence in conflict, but it's a subset of a wider effort that the UK government's got in its policies to try and tackle gender inequality generally, and I think it would be interesting to add that in. Final set of questions, challenges: can we prove the counterfactual, or are there other things that the GPI might do? So terrorist incidents have gone up, but have they gone up less than they might have done without actions to try and combat terrorism? That's a cost-benefit challenge that my colleagues in the Home Office have got. Military shift from having large armies to more on planes and equipment and materiel. Does that mean that we've got better institutes of enforcing law and order or not? Is there a way of tracking the impact of the Arms Trade Treaty so that where military materiel is owned and where it's being traded is in better places than before? And finally, although it's useful to have competing and contrasting indices, I wonder whether there's a sub-project just to map the Global Peace Index alongside the Human Development Index, maybe alongside some Human Rights Index, and put them all together. Thank you.
All our panelists, thank you very much indeed.